welcome back to another episode of Out of the Blank Podcast. Dave, it is a pleasure to have you back, the author of Case Not Closed, to spin on another book that has the title Case Closed. This is about the case against Oswald. It's not really as simple as Lone Nut. There's a lot more complexities, and I think after 60-something years, the amount of stuff that's gone on and things that have been revealed, I think it's left everybody guessing and wondering, when are we actually going to get an answer to it? Of course, there's also a whole host of theories that go along with the JFK case. And I guess you just try and stick to the things where it comes to what the police laid at Oswald's feet, or the Warren Commission labeled with Oswald, that you can look at in court and be like, no, this is not something that is going to solidify his case. So Dave, I want you to introduce yourself real quick, and then we'll get right into the meat and potatoes of the episode.
Thanks, Rob. It's Dave O'Brien. I'm the author of two books on the JFK assassination, Through the Oswald Window, and my recent book is JFK Case Not Closed. And in the second book in particular, Robbie, as you were talking about, we deal with the physical evidence that was used and cited by the Warren Commission to incriminate Lee Harvey Oswald. But we believe that if Oswald, and when I say we, I mean my fellow researcher and I, Johnny Cairns, we believe that if Oswald had lived to stand trial, that all this evidence that the Warren Commission pointed to, ear witnesses, eyewitnesses, physical evidence, would have been contested in a court of law, which wasn't the case when the Warren Commission assembled. And there would have been reasonable doubt as to Oswald at least being a lone assassin.
I want to ask you a little bit about kind of the physical evidence, but I want to ask you mostly, what is the most incriminating piece of evidence that the Warren Commission used to paint Oswald's guilt? I've always mentioned the testimony of Marina Oswald being able to identify Lee Harvey Oswald's rifle. Well, we know with the HSCA, they were able to prove that Marina couldn't tell the difference between a rifle and a shotgun. So there would be no point in even showing her a rifle, because she wouldn't be able to identify it back in 1963, and she wasn't able to identify it before the HSCA. But it seemed like a lot of people mention that, or I even look at that when it comes to, well, his wife said that was his rifle. They found his rifle on the 6th floor, and we don't have to get into the super complex stuff, but what would you say the best piece of evidence the Warren Commission used against Oswald?
Well, the rifle for sure, because they had to associate him with the rifle found in the book depository building. And Johnny, I'm going to defer to Johnny Cairns on this, and I'm going to paraphrase him, because he delved into the rifle situation quite extensively in chapter 4 of my book. And there's a lot of little nitpicky things that when you add them up, it's really quite astounding about the rifle. Now, the Warren Commission said, as you indicated, that Oswald bought the rifle. And all indications are he did that on March 12 of 1963. And but he used the alias A. Hiddle and to purchase the rifle. But the strange thing is, as Johnny Cairns notes, that Oswald used an alias, A. Hiddle, to buy the rifle, but then had the rifle sent to a post office box in Dallas, which was in his name. So it makes absolutely no sense that Oswald would also then take that rifle, take it into the book depository building, and then leave it when he escaped, knowing that the rifle could be brought back to the post office box again in his name, which is incriminating information. And so, as Johnny Cairns points out, there's all kinds of discrepancies and irregularities in the purchase order of the rifle, the money order that was purchased, and the post office box. Everything you can think of can be contested. Everything from the latent print on the Oswald rifle from his palm, and Johnny just goes into like literally 10 different things that had it gone to a public trial, there would have been problems. Whereas the Warren Commission, if you read the Warren report, it's bang, it's done. Oswald owned the rifle. The rifle was found in the book depository building. Oswald worked in the book depository building. Therefore, he was the assassin. It's not quite that clear when you break down the evidence.
What's your opinion on the Warren Commission and the evidence? Because when we're talking about the physical evidence, I mean, how much did the Warren Commission actually collect? It seemed like it was the Dallas police that handled the rifle, then it was sent over to the FBI, and that's where we started finding things like fingerprints and other things way after the fact, at least when Oswald was killed. So obviously, a lot more evidence came out after Oswald died, but the Warren Commission was just a way to put all the evidence together in like a pile and then try and interpret it in their own manner. Necessarily, did they read the information or read the evidence? Anybody's guess. But I think when you're talking about the physical evidence in the Warren Commission, do you separate the two? Because the Warren Commission was just a mouthpiece, and we really have to examine the Dallas police and the FBI, which we knew back then and even now are a little bit corrupt.
Well, for sure. I mean, the Warren Commission. I mean, they weren't. Their investigative main arm was the FBI, and of course, they did rely on the Dallas Police Department and the even the Dallas County Sheriff's Department. And I think the problem is you just raised a good point about the rifle, whereas things changed depending on who had possession of the rifle. So, for instance, when Oswald was first apprehended, it was Chief Jesse Curry went before the media and said that there were no prints that could be associated with Oswald found on the rifle. So when then the rifle goes to the FBI for analysis, and they too indicate that there was no prints that they found on the rifle, no indication of any prints being lifted from the rifle. The rifle goes back to Dallas police after the FBI was finished. And DA Henry Wade goes before the press and announces that a palm print was found on the rifle belonging to Oswald. So, what happened in that scenario? Now, it's only speculation, but it does lend itself to two very sinister possibilities. One, the when Oswald was fingerprinted, it is very possible that a latent print of his palm could have been taken from his fingerprint file and placed on the weapon after it was returned to the Dallas police. That's one thing. And one even more sinister thing is that it's possible that when Oswald was in police custody after he was murdered, a print could have been taken from him while the body was in their custody and then put on the rifle. Now that's all speculation, but it's certainly no different, or it's you can't disclose or dismiss it any more than what the Warren Commission did with the evidence that it faced about the rifle, or any evidence that it faced. But I think the Warren Commission took it a step further. Um, when I went through the Warren Commission, like the whole 26 volumes and the 888-page summary edition, when I was age 13 and 14, the thing that stood out to me more than anything was how there was this pattern, a pattern in which anytime any mention or inference of any evidence that might exonerate Oswald, or at least point to a gunman other than Oswald, this was either dismissed, ignored, altered, or suppressed by the Warren Commission in order to stay on mission of framing Lee Oswald as the assassin of President Kennedy. And so you got, for instance, the one thing that really jumped right out on me was Bobby Hargis, the police motorcycle cop. Now, so I read in, I think it was volume 6 of the supplemental volumes, that's the only area where you'll find his name and what happened to him. And so when we realized that Hargis was positioned at the left rear bumper of the president's car, and he says a spray of the president's blood and brain matter came back at him and covered his sunglasses and the shield of his motorcycle, then the direction of the flow coming back, because he was positioned behind JFK and to his left, that told Hargis that a shot came from his right front. And and so that's a physical thing that happened to Hargis, not just a witness. Something happened to him physically, and yet you won't find Hargis's name or anything about him in the summary edition. Now the problem with that is the 888-page summary edition was mass produced. Millions of people read it. The supplemental editions were limited print. Hardly anyone read them, except for scholars. Maybe the odd library got them, and that was it. So for several years, that type of evidence, whether it's Hargis or ear witness testimony, eyewitness testimony, that suggested there may have been a shot at another location, all of that was dismissed, hidden, or suppressed, and evidence even altered, such as the Altkin 6 photo. And this is a pattern that if you read and take the time to read all of it, it's quite alarming, and that became evident. And I think the Warren Commission was simply an extension of that, and made sure that what it wanted was only evidence to show that Oswald was the lone assassin of President Kennedy. Today, I hope the Trump task force delves into these kinds of situations that we're discussing.
Have you found out what happened to the Bobby Hargis, where he went?
Well, he retired, and he retired believing in his testimony, which said that he felt that the shot came from the right front. In fact, after that occurred, he had a decision to make. He was a police motorcycle cop. There was two things he could do. He could either escort the president to the hospital, or he could stay at the crime scene. Now, he decided to stay at the crime scene because of what happened to him. There's photos showing him dismounting from his bike, and he runs up the grassy knoll. But by the time he gets there, there's all kinds of other people, and there's nothing to be seen except for people mulling about. But he went to his grave convinced that the shot came from the right front, per his testimony, and was simply ignored by the Warren Commission and ignored by the mainstream media for years and years. And it was only independent researchers who finally connected with him and got his story out, and that's why we're aware of it today. And but no, he's an example. Another one being Harold Rydberg, the medical illustrator the Warren Commission hired to illustrate the wounds on President Kennedy, so they didn't have to publish actual autopsy photos. He went to his grave believing that he was duped in misrepresenting the wounds on President Kennedy, and he believed that the president was also shot from the front, from the right front. And so those are the kinds of examples that you encounter if you read the Warren Commission in its entirety, and then some of the books and some of the work of researchers after, such as Mark Lane, that I hope the Trump task force will delve into, and I think it's looking pretty promising.
You said Rydberg's grave. Didn't he die in mysterious circumstances, if I'm not mistaken? Was he the one that shot himself but was using a different, not his main hand, a different hand, wrong hand?
Oh, I don't think it was Rydberg that did that.
There was one
I was
medical
trying to think of
illustrator, you
who.
know what I'm talking about, though, right? There was a guy who apparently shot himself, and there was like a note on the floor that was stomped on, like someone had stepped on it.
Oh, okay. Yes, yes, yes. Yeah, yeah. Now, yeah, he. Did you also? Are you aware that Ida Dox went through the same thing with the House Select Committee on
Yeah, well,
Assassinations?
Tim Smith's been on here talking about Ida Dox, and it's interesting. I have all her testimony online. I put it on my channel for people to be able to look at. She mentions that she was being kind of escorted and talked to and coached by Michael Bodden and other things. And Michael Bodden, I think Tim Smith interviewed him, and he said he told Ida to make the medical illustrations more accurate. That's why he was suggesting that she do certain things. And it's like, what do you mean more accurate? Just let them represent. And then they had another person in the room that would watch her with the original copies. She'd get limited time with those, so she had to draw them as fast as she could, so then she could do in her free time with the copies, she could draw more detail if she wanted. And I'm like, that doesn't sound like anything that should be going on if you're trying to write actual medical illustration copies, at least of what the original autopsy photographs and other things were showing.
You're right, exactly. And I think the issue there is that Dr. Bodden could never admit or understand that the autopsy photos he was given were forgeries, were misrepresentations. And those are the photos that he provided to Ida Dox to do her diagrams. And so that everything is based on misinformation and misplacement of wounds. For instance, Dr. Bodden, Dr. Cyril Weck, and Dr. Gary Aguilar had this conference in Washington, and Dr. Aguilar had uncovered the evidence of the 26 medical professionals at the autopsy who had viewed the president's body, all of whom said that there was a large gaping exit wound at the right rear of his skull. And some of them even provided diagrams to that effect. And when Dr. Aguilar asked Dr. Weck and Dr. Bodden, who were on the forensics panel of the House Select Committee, if they were aware of this, of all this 26 medical experts, as well as the 20 Parkland medical professionals, they weren't. They had never heard of it. And so that tells us that Dr. Bodden, when the autopsy photos that he got, and if you look at those autopsy photos, that's exactly what Ida Dox represented. So she accurately represented the photos. The problem is the photos themselves are forgeries and never happened because Ida Dox was never shown a photo showing a gaping exit wound at the back of the president's head, just an entry wound in the cowlick area. And so that's where the problem is. And that's just the second sequence to the same thing happening to Harold Rydberg in 1964 with the Warren Commission.
Why do you think that they were trying so hard, like the HSCA, like Michael Bodden, for instance, was trying so hard to just squash out conspiracy? I mean, there's a lot of people like Weck that served on there that was looking for conspiracy, and I think they actually opened up the door a little bit more. Most of the HSCA members that were a part of the actual committee, listening to people like Blakey and others give their things, the committee members, they were all very good questions, and they were actually, if you listen to the audio, I have it all on my channel. It's very much so of opening up the door for like, yep, that's none of this is making sense. I think Sawyer's the best one because he's from like Texas or something. And he was like, you didn't bother checking the blanket in the garage for the rifle if you knew it was in there. It seems like the logical thing would be to check the blanket. And Rena's kind of like, and it's just like, it opens the door for, I think a lot of people are seeing that this wasn't making much sense.
Yeah, I think Bodden is an innocent person here. I think he was given photos that he thought were authentic, and Dr. Weck believes they aren't. They weren't authentic because he did see the original autopsy photos in the National Archives. At the time, Dr. Bodden had not. So he accepted the photos provided to him by the House Select Committee as authentic. And that's what he based when he gave them to Ida Dox. He says, we want you to represent these, but more tastefully, of course, which he did. And so I think Bodden is an innocent player in this instance. Ida Dox is, Harold Rydberg is. They were just they were all guided into doing what they did. So I don't fault Bodden whatsoever. And Dr. Weck is the only one who believed from moment one that the autopsy photos and even the x-rays that they were examining at the forensics panel for the House Select Committee were not accurate. And this has subsequently been also verified by Doctors Mantic, Dr. David Mantic, and Dr. Charles Chesser, Dr. Michael Chesser. Yeah, they have both studied the X-rays in particular, and both have said that the X-rays show missing bone at the right rear occipital region of the president's head, which is not shown in the photos given to Dr. Bodden and then subsequently given to Ida Dox. And so that's where we're at with this whole thing right now. And that is an area, by the way, that the Trump task force can definitely delve into because it's still existing physical evidence that can be studied and new technologies applied to.
What about Commission Exhibit 399? It seemed like a lot of people have problems with the magic bullet theory, but it seemed like every testimony I've heard from someone like Connolly, let's take him, doesn't believe the same shot that hit Kennedy hit him. That goes against the single bullet theory, the magic bullet idea. But then he's conclusions, he's right. He says, I agree with the Warren Commission on their conclusions of their findings. It's like, well, your biggest thing and their whole argument is like the magic bullet and this type of stuff to make those wounds and go through both people. Then you have Malcolm Kilduff doing the same thing. He didn't buy the magic bullet nonsense, thinks it's impossible for a bullet to turn midair and 45 degree and tumble and do all this crap, but then still agrees with the conclusions of the Warren Commission. You have so many others, HSCA members, that put their dissent in their HSCA final conclusions, where it was all about the magic bullet theory. Nobody really bought that a bullet could do that. It seems like an impossibility.
Well, and not only that, there was three of the original Warren Commission members who dissented on not only the magic bullet theory, but that Oswald acted alone. And they asked to write a minority report and were denied by Chief Justice Warren. So a lot of people aren't aware that it was not a unanimous report that was issued. But as far as Commission Exhibit 399 goes, the best way to look at that is what Dr. Cyril Weck has. You can find it on YouTube. He does a presentation in which he analyzes the actual test firings by the FBI of bullets trying to emulate what the magic bullet is supposed to have done, which of course is go through two men, cause 7 wounds, broke two major bones, including a rib bone in Connolly and his distal radius bone in his wrist. So what the commission did was they got the FBI to test fire Oswald's weapon and identical ammunition. And the first thing they did is they test fired that kind of bullet into large vats of cotton wadding. And to do that, the reason they did that was because they wanted to show what would be the condition of the bullet having struck virtually nothing of substance. And when they got retrieved those bullets, they looked remarkably like Commission Exhibit 399, which the commission said went through two men, caused 7 wounds, two broken bones. The next test firing they did was they got the carcass of a goat, and they positioned it so that the bullet would go through the rib to simulate the rib wound sustained by Connolly. Again, the wound in the goat was similar to Connolly, but the bullet that came out of it was misshapen, and quite a bit misshapen compared to CE 399. But the last one is the killer. They test fired identical bullets into the wrist of human cadavers to simulate Connolly's wrist wound. And the x-rays that the Warren Commission published show a wrist wound in the cadavers that is remarkably identical to what Connolly sustained, a hole clean through the distal radius bone. The problem is there's only half a bullet left. And so what we have, the commission was hoping that if they could show that the CE 399 could cause the most severe wound in Governor Connolly, the wrist wound, then it could reasonably conclude that it caused all the lesser wounds. But that backfired completely. And Dr. Weck took great delight in noting that this is a prime example of physical evidence that the commission had, their very own ballistic tests, that showed that Commission CE 399 could not have caused all the wounds attributed to it or the flight path. And yet, despite those testings, the Warren Commission said this is the one instance in which CE 399 did cause all those wounds attributed to it. Nonsense.
Even with the HSCA, I think they were able to prove that the pistol, they couldn't match the shots. They couldn't reshoot it because it had been shot a number of times by the FBI to the point where the pistol was damaged beyond, I think, even test capabilities. If I'm not mistaken, the HSCA proved, I believe it was Robert Edgar of the staff that was asking them questions about the pistol. And then it brought up the automatic ammunition pistol ammo that was found, and they couldn't link those to Oswald either. So there's a lot about, like, I think when the Warren Commission, obviously we've talked about it in the past, but when they put all this in there, it looks really, really good. And especially if you're just reading a summary, a lot of people aren't going to go and dive a step further. That's why I think a lot of us in the research community have been trying to tell people, look at the evidence, like read the Warren Commission itself. It'll tell you, like, it's not as so simple. Like, they went through a lot of stuff. They threw a lot of crap in there, and a lot of it doesn't really stick with Oswald. Another thing, back to what you were saying in the beginning, when you're trusting ear witnesses and eyewitnesses, what are your thoughts on Connolly stating that he didn't believe the bullet hit him, the same one that hit Kennedy, but he also said that it came from his right, behind him to his right, and he was talking about the area in the direction of the Texas School Book Depository?
I think he was absolutely 100% correct. But because I think there were two shooters to the behind him and to the right a little bit. One was the sixth floor book depository window, and one was, I believe, at the Dow Tex building. And I think that both Kennedy and Connolly were hit by shots fired almost simultaneous to each other, but from two different assassins to the rear. And the ear witnesses, one of the things that's fascinating about ear witnesses, and I mentioned this in my second book, even the ear witnesses that said that they thought they heard all three shots come from the book depository building, even they prove a second gunman. And now, how is that possible? Because that jives with Oswald being the shooter in the sixth floor window, if all three shots they heard came from that window. Well, here's the problem. When those witnesses, even the ones that said book depository only, When they were asked to describe the spacing of the shots rather than where they thought they come from, here's what they did. They went like this. Here's the spacing of the shots they described. So the problem with that is shots 1 and 2 could have come from the Oswald window. No problem with that at all. But the second and third shots that all ear witnesses reported were so close together that it could not have possibly come from the Oswald rifle, because the FBI established that the minimum firing time to manually operate and fire a second shot was 2.3 seconds. And so, but the sound of the shots by all ear witnesses, like literally almost all of them, indicate that the two second, third shots were so close together that, well, it just couldn't have come from the Oswald rifle. It had to have come from another weapon. Now, this could have been somebody at the Daltex building, which was adjacent to the book depository building, but other evidence suggests that it was the grassy knoll shot that they heard.
I guess the main point would be if you look at Connolly's testimony that there could have been shots from the Texas School Book Depository, but doesn't mean it was Oswald that was firing those shots.
Oh, 100% right. And in fact, the evidence suggests limited evidence by all means, but it does suggest that Oswald was not the person at the window. And I've always believed that Oswald was involved in the assassination. That's where I part from a lot of fellow conspiracy theorists. I believe that Oswald would set up the sniper's nest for the assassin, but didn't know that he was being set up as the lone assassin. And so when you talk about Connolly and hearing the shots from behind, but was Oswald at the window? The limited evidence suggests no. So there's two witnesses, for instance, that suggest Oswald couldn't have been at the window. Carolyn Arnold, who says she saw Oswald on the first floor, literally 2 or 3 minutes before the shooting, and Geraldine Reed, who said she had a transaction with Oswald, provided him with the coins that he needed to buy a pop from the vending machine. And then he went into the lunchroom, and that's when he had his encounter with Marion Baker, the cop.
And Virgil Akis Campbell, the vice president of the Texas School Book Depository, stated that he saw Oswald on the front steps.
There you go. And now that has been, I don't know if it's been positively corrected to say it was Billy Nolan.
It's Billy Lovelady. Yeah, I believe it's Billy Lovelady, but it's just another testimony. The issue is that you've started your YouTube channel to talk about this, and you'll run into these comments, but people always go, Oswald was positively identified in that window. No, he wasn't. There's not a single person that specifically saw Oswald in that window. You even have Malcolm Kilduff, who turned around with, beside him was the guy who took the photograph and gave the testimony. I think it's Robert something. Famous reporter, made a photograph, but he talked about seeing a rifle barrel sticking out of the window. Malcolm Kilduff states, I saw no rifle barrel. There was nothing in that window. He was the one that turned around. It was the same press car right beside him. So, again, you get into this point where it's like, all right, nobody was able to identify Oswald in that window. Actually, you have many witnesses that have stated something completely different. They've described someone that looks like Mac Wallace with the circular glasses in the window. They described two people up in that window. They've described everything really but Oswald. There's not a single person that stated. I think there's one the Warren Commission used, but then he ended up not even remembering, having to come back and give testimony later. It's what the lone nuts always use as an example. But you have many ear witnesses, eyewitnesses, people that were around the Texas School Book Depository that saw something else. And the Warren Commission decided to include their testimony, but not highlight it, bury it into the deck of all these people that gave statements out of the ones that they chose to talk to. There were plenty of others that Mark Lane had to film on his own and get statements from that said they saw something on the overpass or something by the knoll area, seeing smoke come up from the knoll. That was completely disregarded. I think even the HSCA was talking about examining the whole smoke from the knoll. Could it be possible that these people saw something and it wasn't looked at? And the guy who was talking about photos was analyzing things and talking about, well, cigarette smoke can show up like that too. I'm like, I don't know, unless you're puffing a big cigarette, maybe. It just seems like you guys are doing an extra mental gymnastics to make sure that the evidence doesn't show that there was anything else.
Well, I had, yeah, you're absolutely right. And I had a kind of an interesting situation. I became one of the few researchers and reporters ever granted access to the book depository building when it was locked and sealed from the public in 1979. And so I was at the Oswald window, and I was able to look down to the kill site. But there was something else that I did that that tells me that Oswald couldn't have been the assassin at the window as well, and that is the escape route. So what I did was, as we know, the Warren Commission says Oswald completed the shooting, ditched his rifle, ran over to the northwest corner stairwell, and ran down 4 flights of stairs, and went to the second floor lunchroom, where 90 seconds later he encountered Officer Marion Baker. So first question is, could he have done that? And I think it's been well established that the timing is such that Oswald could have done that. In fact, I did that. I went from the Oswald window to the second floor lunchroom when I was in the building. I did it in under 90 seconds. And so that wasn't the issue. But there is an issue. And the issue is Oswald and how he appeared to Officer Baker. So when I did that, I was almost Oswald's age, just a few years older, 27. And I was very athletic at the time. So I didn't run, but I briskly went down the stairs, went to the second floor lunchroom. And the host that I had from Dallas County, his name was William Smith, he came with me. And he noticed that when I got down to the second floor lunchroom and we counted 90 seconds, which means then Officer Baker would have come in, pointed his gun at my head, and then decided, okay, you're okay, off he goes. Well, here's the problem. It's not that Oswald couldn't get there, he could. But William Smith said that when I got there, I was slightly out of breath. I was slightly flushed in the cheeks. I was clearly, I had clearly exerted myself. And then if I had been asked any questions, it would have become very evident that I had just gotten there hurriedly. But Oswald, according to Marion Baker and Roy Truly, his boss, he was completely composed, calm, collected, didn't say a word, appeared nonchalant. So Baker leaves, Oswald exits. And to me, that indicates very strongly that Oswald could not have been at the sixth floor window and then encountered Baker 90 seconds later. He was in the second floor lunchroom where Geraldine Reed placed him, and Oswald placed himself 90 seconds after the shots.
How difficult is it for you to mention ear witnesses and eyewitnesses when a lot of people try and find ways to completely disregard ear and eyewitness testimony? They'll say something like eyewitness testimony is unreliable, ear witness testimony is unreliable. I mean, if you really examine ear witness testimony, Connolly's the best one because he was the only one that identified it as a rifle shot when all the Secret Service members and people that are specifically trained for these types of scenarios couldn't identify what it was, if it was a firecracker or not. Connolly's the only one reacted, and then Clint Hill was the only Secret Service person that actually hopped on the spot. So how do you handle the whole ear witness and eyewitness conversation when you're using testimonies and things of that sort? Because people always toss out forensics, or they'll toss out something else that goes over a lot of people's heads. But in this kind of conversation, you have to understand that the evidence might have been manipulated or altered to fit a certain conclusion. So you can't just disregard however many witnesses, 70, 100 something people that might have said that they heard something else than the official narrative.
Yeah, exactly. And it's frustrating. But the fact remains that in this day and age, ear witness testimony, eyewitness testimony is still presented in a court of law to either approve or an accused innocence or guilt. That is fact. It happens every single time in a major crime scene trial. Now, but the problem here is that we have it's the quality of witnesses that we have. So you've got the 20 Parkland medical professionals, all of whom say back wound, gaping exit wound at the back of the head. 26 medical professionals at the autopsy. But the one guy that stands out to me, and I'm doing a presentation on my YouTube channel about him, is Tom Robinson. For those who don't know Tom Robinson, he was the mortician that looked after JFK that night. Now, here's a man who had JFK's body in front of him and had to deal with every wound on his body. in order to decide how he was going to prepare the body for A, private viewing by the Kennedy family, and B, burial. And so no other person saw all the wounds on JFK. Tom Robinson did. And it's because he had to do something with every wound, from the gaping exit wound in the head to the throat wound to the small wound in the upper back. He had to deal with all of it. And Tom Robinson provided testimony to the Warren. He was never called by the Warren Commission. Never, ever. He was called by the House Select Committee. In the House Select Committee, he testified that he's had to repair a gaping exit wound at the back of the president's head, and he provided an illustration to show where that wound was that he had to repair. So there's an example where that has now come out, so we know about it. And yet the lone nutters say, "Oh, it's all made up. It's just." So you can't compete against that. You can't convince them. You can only lay it all out and hope that the accumulative effect of all the physical evidence, which is what the YouTube channel's about and what my second book was about with Johnny Cairns, is to take all the physical evidence and witnesses, paint the picture of them collectively, and then say, what do you think? And I think a reasonable person would conclude that there was obviously a massive cover up by two government investigations into the assassination of President Kennedy.
Do you think it was because of the fact of a giant grand conspiracy, or do you think it's because they got the wrong guy and now the guy is dead? So to avoid any other problems you might deal with the press or any other situations like that, it's very simple to just kind of just let it go, keep it going, and keep the lie going. I think the Dallas police were responsible for getting Jack Ruby to shoot Oswald, in my opinion, my belief. But I also think it's because they had a long list of people with subversive backgrounds, and Oswald wasn't on that list, and the FBI was supposed to warn them about these types of people. It always gets mentioned, but I think if you examine Henry Wade's conviction rates and you examine the number of people he sent to the death or the electric chair wrongfully, how many times in an interrogation that's not recorded did they say things that he didn't say? Did they do things unethically to get an answer or get a statement from him? And I think the silencing factor was the point that they might have got the wrong guy, and now they have the FBI and all these other agencies that are now snooping around, and they want to cover up some of the other things that go on in that department. That makes a hell of a lot more sense than something of like, I don't know, just a grand super cover up conspiracy. I think it was just they had to keep lying now at this point because they realized that a person died on their watch.
Yeah, I think it was Mark Lane who established that Jack Ruby knew up to 80% of all the Dallas police officers. And so it lends itself to a couple of possibilities. Either they were complicit in Ruby being able to wander about, act as a press reporter, ask questions, or make a point. He was the one that corrected Henry Wade about Oswald's affiliation with the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. And so it was either Ruby was able to do that because of his association with the police, or the police were complicit in as you suggest they might be, in actually killing Oswald. And so I think the problem over the years has been that they got the wrong guy. We know the Dallas police was corrupt. And not only that, but there's a bigger picture, I think. And that is that I believe that there was a conspiracy to kill the president and that Oswald was involved. And that the conspiracy involved the CIA working with organized crime that goes back to the Bay of Pigs invasion, which we now know through released files was an alliance that was very disturbing. In fact, if it had been known back then that the CIA was working with organized crime to assassinate Fidel Castro and try to get him out of office, then I think that would have been very alarming. So that was worth, in their view, covering up. And the fact that Oswald had an affiliation with David Ferrie, who had an affiliation with E. Howard Hunt and Frank Sturgis over the Bay of Pigs situation, and even Jack Ruby as a gun runner, and Jack Ruby's association with Santos Trafficante and Carlos Marcello. And so when you start to connect all these dots, that tells me why it was decided early on this has to be covered up because we've got the American government in the form of ex-CIA agents or rebel CIA agents working with organized crime to do nefarious things that the US public was not aware of. And I think that's where it all, and then once that happens, it's like a snowball effect where you start conspiring and covering up. You can't stop it. It's really hard to stop it. And then 40 years go by, and then things start to unravel. The Freedom of Information Act, who would have anticipated that happening? And if that had not happened, I don't think we'd be anywhere near where we are today. And so I think that's the situation, Robbie, where today, and I think the task force that's going on now is recognizing that, and they seem to be willing to consider at least like areas like Tom Robinson, Bobby Hargis, the physical evidence, things that just don't seem right now that we re-examine them all these years later. And I think new technologies are the answer. I think we're for your younger audience. I think we're closer to knowing the truth about the JFK assassination than what people think because of new applications of technology that can be applied to existing physical evidence that is in the National Archives today.
How many people do you believe found out about the conspiracy, or maybe that there was more than Lee Harvey Oswald involved in the administration, the Kennedy administration or the Johnson administration? Obviously, there's a lot of close people to JFK, and there was a lot of close people just in that administration that had many statements and interviews later on in life. But how many do you believe knew what was going on compared to how many believe found out later?
Well, I think it was probably a smaller crowd at the beginning, but the more I think the more relevant thing is who knew, and I think Hoover knew, and I think like Katzenbach, his assistant, knew. I think Johnson had to have known that it was not Oswald who did this and made the decision that there had to be this panel assembled since Oswald was killed to cover up the facts. And so it started small, but it was the right people, the big people, who decided this had to happen, and then everything else fell into place. And it just became the way it was. Now, keep in mind that it was Johnson who decided that all these files on the JFK assassination were originally scheduled to be sealed until 2038, 75 years later. So that was the mind frame of the Warren Commission when it put its report together. They said, we're not going to have to worry about this for 75 years, so we can say what we want. There's no trial. He wasn't given a lawyer representation before the commission. It was a nice 75-year cover up wrapped in a bow. And then the Freedom of Information Act in 1968 started to unravel that. And independent researchers like Mark Lane, Penn Jones Jr., Harold Weisberg, Josiah Thompson, they started chipping away at it. And but it still, remember, it still took 12 years, 1975, before anyone saw the Zapruder film. So for 12 years, that we were fed this line of Oswald acted alone, and all the shots came from behind, and nobody had ever seen the president's head snap backward as a result of the fatal headshot. It was all what the Warren Commission said, and the mainstream media simply reported what the Warren Commission said rather than delve into it themselves. And so the whole Oswald acted alone thing had a 12-year head start on everything associated with the Kennedy assassination, and we've been catching up ever since.
What is your opinion on certain individuals that made statements later that might be dissenting from the Warren Commission's official narrative, whether it's in an interview that you might have came across? I think everyone always mentions like John Cooper having dissent on the magic bullet. I think it's also Hale Boggs had dissent, and then I also think Richard Russell had a bit of dissent. He didn't think that the Connolly same bullet, magic bullet thing didn't make any sense to him at all. He actually trusted Connolly's statement that it wasn't the same bullet that hit JFK that hit Connolly. But what about these people that just come out later through time and make like a deathbed confession or make some type of statement about just dissent from the official narrative after they might have been pushing it for so long? How do you trust those?
Well, that's how cover-ups eventually uncover. And as you said, there was 3 Warren Commission
Well, we got Johnson on tape saying that he thought it was a Castro type thing. He's on a phone call with Richard Russell. They were talking about Khrushchev. Oh, we can't blame Khrushchev for this. And then Richard Russell's like, well, I don't think he had all the involvement. And he was like acting like he might have had a little bit of involvement. And then they got to the Castro, like, honestly, you want my opinion? I think it was Castro. And he goes, that's fine. You go ahead and state your opinion. I'll throw it in the Warren Commission. That's fine.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And so you've got these three Warren Commission members who imagine this. They're in all the meetings. They're privy to all the accumulative information. And then the Warren report is written, and three of them say, I don't believe it. I don't believe Oswald acted alone, and I don't believe in the single bullet theory that Arlen Specter created. And so they asked to formally write a minority report and attach it to the Warren Commission. And Chief Justice Warren said, no, you can't do that. And so for a while, they did the right thing. They went along with it. But toward their later years in life, they want the truth to come out. And Connolly's about the only guy I've ever encountered that this was his statement right from day one. And that's his testimony, that he didn't think the shot that first struck President Kennedy struck him. And the Warren Commission simply disregarded it. And but that's exactly part of the uncovering up of the JFK assassination, and we should be grateful for those kinds of people because I think the latest stats show that now 65% of the American public do not believe that there was just Lee Harvey Oswald.
I think Connolly's the one that wanted, what was it? He wanted to get the trademark specifically and fought with the Secret Service over that, over the women's building, which they might not even gone through Dealey Plaza about. But he stated, like when he was being asked by Samuel Devine of the HSCA, why did you try and delay and not want a motorcade? And Connolly's just was refusing on doing a motorcade. He wanted to wait till later. He was even refusing to go to Dallas for a while until his election stuff was over with. But when they finally decided to go, and he's kind of like having hesitation on the motorcade thing, his opinion or his reasoning for that was stating that he knows the wear and tear that it puts on a person to do a motorcade. Kennedy was getting up at these hours. We were rushing him from here to here to here. And he was very concerned about the president's like well-being, of just what that can do to you physically and mentally. And then Samuel Devine just goes, so you're aware of that, but you were also aware that General Walker had been shot at and Adlai Stevenson had been attacked, and you weren't scared or nervous that Dallas was going to have any bad reception to President Kennedy. And then he stutters and goes, no, I have my people look into those issues, or something like, he states something like that. I'm like, yes, I can't believe him, because he's talking about caring for the president and being very cautious of his health and his rest, but he's not paying attention to the fact that obviously there was some bad reception in Dallas when it came to other people of lesser importance or lesser popularity at the time.
It's, I don't know if I can add anything to that except the political environment at the time in Dallas was very anti-Kennedy, and so you remember seeing the placard that was posted and newspaper ads taken against Kennedy, and so Connolly had to have been aware of that. There was political infighting amongst the Democrats, and I think that I don't think that Connolly was complicit in any way, shape, or form, but and I don't know how much control he had over the motorcade itself. But I tend to more look at the Secret Service, at that whole thing as to how the motorcade happened, the roof not being on. Was there a route change? I've had misinformation or different kinds of information. Was there a last second motor route change? I think that's the areas that need to be studied. And I was disappointed in Connolly at the very end when he died, and his wife wouldn't allow the fragments that remained in his body to be taken out of him, because they could have been tested against Commission Exhibit 399. And I think we would know a lot more about the single bullet theory had she allowed that to happen. Sorry to take you that direction.
No, it was good. Connolly stated that they didn't actually finalize the route until like the week of the motorcade trip, but Richardson Pryor, the head of the JFK subcommittee for the HSCA that was investigating Martin Luther King, all those things, he was specifically for the JFK thing. He brought up the fact that if this was published in the newspaper beforehand, Oswald got a job at the book depository on October 15th. Did he know or have any information where that route would have went right by his work to get to the trademark? And Connolly stated no, it would be impossible for him to know that. So again, that's only bringing Oswald, like he would only have 2 days, I think, to be able to bring a rifle into work and find like the perfect vantage point. It's just a lot in that short amount of time to kind of think that Oswald had this strategically planned out, like some people like Malcolm Kilduff and others have kind of reiterated to believe. Again, makes it very difficult to understand the situation. I mean, who do you think had prior knowledge if you had to think of somebody with prior knowledge? You think it was someone like Hoover? Because obviously the people that ran those agencies and things like that, their hands are all over the cover up. There's 100% pure evidence of a cover up. Nothing but Oswald. There's no conspiracy within 48 hours, no getaway driver, nothing. So again, whether that's for keep the country safe or stop blaming Russia for certain things, I don't know. But again, that's not an investigation. And I think like Hoover and other members have their hands all over that.
I agree with you about Hoover, and I think that the Secret Service also is has always bothered me.
Have you heard James Rowley's testimony about the Secret Service?
I don't think I have.
They asked him about. I got it online, but they asked him Sawyer, the guy from Texas. I think he's from Texas. He's from some southern state, but he's got the best accent in the world. But he's like, you don't think your Secret Service have the slow reaction times? Like, I'm pretty surprised watching the Zapruder film. It seems like Connolly's the only one reacting. And then James Rowley's like, I don't think my Secret Service had slow reaction time at all. If you actually watch the Zapruder film, you see Clint Hill rush to the car and do that. And then like they mentioned it, Clint Hill was the only one that reacted and out of all your guys. And then he mentions, well, I don't think this Zapruder film shows it, but you can see from photos that there's another car behind and two Secret Service had the door open like they were going to get out of the car and the photo was taken. I was like, well, you toss that out there because if we don't actually have film of it or photos of it, then it's just a hypothetical. And now you're just tossing it out to save your own skin. But he defended his Secret Service reaction times, which doesn't make sense because there was only one guy that reacted. Even, William Greer, who gets blamed for a lot of stuff, stopped the car twice to look back at the president.
Yeah, and then from there, of course, it spreads that well, Bill Greer had a gun and reached back and shot at the president, and that's what happens when this kind of stuff is discussed. It gets overblown, and so I think that the Secret Service. I don't know. Did you ever have anybody on about the Secret Service
Many
agent?
time, Vince and others. Yeah, yeah. That's I don't think they ever identified who that was, but it was Buddy Walters was the one that was talking about finding a bullet that was in the grass. And there's photos of I think it's Jim. Oh God, Jim Murray, I think his name is. He's the one that took the photographs of the guy bending down, picking up something, and then you see his hand go in his pocket and then walk that way.
Wow. And what about the Secret Service agent that said he found the bullet and then on the limousine and
Paul
turned it over?
Landis.
No, he didn't turn it over. Yeah,
Paul Landis talked about finding the magic bullet when he wrote his book, though. But that's the thing is that like there's Malcolm Kilduff stated it. He said, "I don't believe the magic bullet theory, and the way that I know I don't believe it is it doesn't make sense. But the fact that the Warren Commission locked themselves in on 3 shots." And he goes, it was those 3 shots. They couldn't go anywhere. So this had to be created. They didn't want to admit that one shot missed. And we know one shot missed. We know that is why the magic bullet theory had to be created to make all those wounds. You could have just had them all hit inside the car, like Hoover said on the phone call with LBJ on like the 25th. So again, when you look at like the shots and the bullets, there were bullet casings that were pulled out of the limousine that were never submitted into evidence. There was a piece of skull found on the C-130 when the car was getting transported back. Then there's also a piece of skull found in the street. That was by the Harper fragment. Then there was another one by Walter Evans found on the same street, another smaller piece that was found and was never submitted into evidence. I have him on his oral history for the 6-4 Museum stating that. He was a reporter at the time. He got there around like 6 p.m. or 7 p.m. And his interview is just it's the radio program transcript, and it just shows you what they talked about each hour. And it's like 7 p.m. They talked about the extra skull fragment. But there were like 3 or 4 different people that found pieces of skull. Again, where's that evidence? Why don't we have photos of that? The only one we have is the Harper fragment, which apparently we've lost the actual piece of evidence for that. And that's a piece of the occipital bone back here, which would tell us so much if we had it. So,
Well, yeah. I mean, if it's the occipital bone, what does that tell you?
but why does those things go missing? That makes no sense.
Exactly. So much goes missing, and like the president's brain. Man, if we could have done a normal autopsy procedure on the brain, which is typically follows 2 weeks after the brain is removed, and it's in a formalin solution. And as Dr. Weck has pointed out so many times, that would have told us everything about the trajectory of any one or two or more bullets that entered his head, or even bullet fragments. We now know that there was a snowstorm of bullet fragments found that went from the front of his head to the rear just before exiting in a V shape. Snowstorm of bullets that you can see in the X-ray of President Kennedy, the side view, and Dr. Michael Chesser is the one that pointed it out. But then we find out that the Warren Commission knew about that, and even though it indicates that the fragments went from front to back, the Warren Commission had to account for it. And so what they did was they said, oh, well, that's from the bullet that went in the cowlick area of the skull, and then went the other way. So that's the kind of thing I think now that medical professionals who look at the X-rays, the actual X-rays in the National Archives, we can start to now and apply new technologies, and we can make those determinations more emphatically. And I think we will eventually find out that that kind of evidence is suggestive of a shot that struck the president in the front. And I'm not saying he wasn't hit from behind. I think he was in the head. But I think that a more powerful bullet and weapon fired a second shot simultaneously to the first shot. So he got hit in the head, and then a shot from the front is what drove him back and to the left, not a neuromuscular reaction from the president that the Warren Commission put forth.
I think Gary Aguilar has debunked that neuromuscular reaction. That there's not one.
And
that
Michael
really
Chesser
exists.
too. Yeah. Yeah.
I wanted to ask you about the interview you did for the Sixth Floor Museum. This will be posted after that interview comes out, so there's not a worry about spoiling it. But what was that like? Because I've enjoyed the oral histories, so many of them. I actually used some of them. I mean, the most interesting one's Sam Pate on his discussion about Ruby. I recommend looking it up because I played it on my most recent episode when we're recording this, but yeah, he mentioned some things that are obviously, there are some things where you're listening to someone and you go, what the hell is he talking about? And then there's other things where a lot of people mention things. I think I've heard a lot of people have a dissent on a certain factor. I think Bob Welch, who was a reporter at the time, he's definitive that it was Oswald who did it, and there's nothing that can change his mind on it. He even thinks that he shot at Walker too. But then you hear him talk about it, he goes, what I didn't understand was that how could someone shoot at someone like Walker and miss when he's inside of his home, but then be able to hit a target moving however many yards away and at a certain speed? He's like, I never could get over that. And he's saying this in like 2000 or like 19 whatever when they recorded it, old style. I think it was before Stephen Fagan took over. And he literally states, he goes, that's a project for anybody out there listening. If you want to do some research, look into that. And then he explains the whole Walker and the Kennedy differences. And I'm like, yeah, that's what I think we all kind of mentioned that as like good evidence to support, because if you Google right now what Lee Harvey Oswald thought of President Kennedy, it's conflicting. It says conflicting statements. There's not a confliction of statements. There's a well-established record that he had no dissent against President Kennedy. Everyone, George de Morenshield's testimony, Marina Oswald's testimony, Ruth Payne's testimony, all these people, if they heard him mention anything about politics when he did, it was never anything bad about Kennedy. He admired President Kennedy for being so young and very charismatic. So again, that does not make sense why he would shoot the man. So I want just to mention that because it's kind of a little upsetting that you can easily find a lot of this stuff if you look at the testimony, but anybody's just going to type into Google and then whatever Google pops up for them saying the official narrative is going to be what they're going to go with.
Well, I'm really excited about being part of the oral history of the JFK assassination, and it hasn't been posted yet on the Sixth Floor Museum YouTube channel, but I think that's going to happen soon. But I think I was always bothered by the fact that I don't think the museum itself, or much of the videos that they presented in the past, allowed for conspiracy or the notion of everything that we've been talking about.
They've threatened to sue documentary people and researchers for using the Zapruder film because they claim the rights to it.
Right.
They tried to sue Randy Benson. He had to get Taylor University to help him out. I mean, it's a conspiracy film. If it was an official narrative, I'm sure they would have went with it.
Yeah. exactly. And I think under Stephen Fagan's tutelage, I think the museum is slowly moving toward at least being open to that kind of dialogue. And that's why he asked me to do a presentation or at least do an interview with him, is because he realized that I was one of the few people ever at that window before it was locked and sealed and became the museum. And and he also knows that I made observations from that window that to me strongly suggest a conspiracy to kill the president of the United States, and that it could not have been one assassin at that window, whoever it was. And so he knew that when he interviewed me, and he allowed it to happen. So hats off to Stephen Fagan. And I think that we're moving in that direction of at least having an open mind as to what happened on that day. And I'm glad I got to tell my story about it.
Did is there anything you could share with me? Because this, like I said, it's going to come afterward, so it'll be way after the video for the sixth floor gets released, so you won't be spoiling anything. But is there anything you can share, that any tense moments, or you felt like he wasn't going to ask a follow-up question on something you might have said about a conspiracy? Because I've watched many times him just completely drop the ball, whether it's purposely or accidentally. And I will give him credit for doing what he does. It's important. I don't care how minor the person is, whether there's a delivery truck driver guy that was on there that never even went to the Texas School Book Depository. He wasn't even in the area, but he had delivered books that day or something. I don't know. He just had no information. But it's history and it's important. So I will give him credit for that. But did you feel like he missed any follow ups, or you were maybe trying to lead him into something and he didn't want to pick it up? Like he was kind of trying to steer away from certain points?
You know what? It was the opposite. He knew what I was going to say. And I was, the one thing that surprised me was how few questions he asked. He just, but that was a good thing. He would ask a question, and even though he knew I was going to go down the road of conspiracy and point out things that I saw, like the oak tree and why the shot didn't occur on Houston Street, and me finding a smarter assassin's nest at the far end of the building. He let me tell my story completely, never interrupted me, I never had a yeah but from him or anything like that. He wasn't there to contest me in any way. He let me just talk, and I think we ended up talking for, I think, just under an hour. And but it's just me on film, him asking a question in the background and letting me go. And so I was kind of pleased by that, because I went to Dallas for that purpose, and I didn't know what I was going to walk into, because I'd seen all these videos before where it was kind of anti-conspiracy, and so I was nervous. But to his credit, he let me go. He let me tell my story, and I don't expect there to be any editing done, because he sent me a copy of it that will appear on the YouTube channel. I just can't publicize it before it is posted by the museum. So I was pleasantly surprised, Robbie.
Did he say anything off air to you about the whole case or his opinion on anything?
No, he's very careful not to do that. He still has to walk a line, I think, as the curator. But I did mention to him, I said, I'm because I had done the museum the day before, and I said, you're starting to talk about conspiracy and other possibilities, and I that weren't there before when I had been there. And he said, yeah, we're trying to get there. Like, he opened up the library. He asked me to donate my two books to the library, which I did, and both are about conspiracy and the evidence the Warren Commission dismissed and ignored and all that stuff. So he is showing signs of changing the library and the museum itself, and I'm grateful for that.
Yeah, definitely changing my opinion on him. I never had a bad one on him. I just looked at so much stuff from here, and I'm like, damn, why didn't he ask this, or why didn't? But I understand it's different times, I guess. And for a lot of the time, I've just heard so many stories from researchers about just bad experiences with the sixth floor museum in general. Not, I don't think Steve in particular, but I think it's important because you got to have both sides. Even if like trying to find a balance, you need to have a lot of this information out there. I'm not a fan of all the theories of LBJ did it or any types of stuff like this. I mean, if you got evidence for it, go ahead. But making hypotheticals like it was because the Vietnam War had to happen, I'm like, that's like fucking crystal ball stuff, man. There's maybe I don't know. But Dave, I
Well, thanks to
appreciate.
people like you, Robbie. thanks to people like you, we do have that counterbalance because you invite people like me on to talk, and you post it and on your podcast, on YouTube, and so we get all this dialogue that you would never get if you go to the museum. But again, that's changing very gradually, and I think it will change in the future if they want to stay alive as a museum. So thanks to people like you, I wish you were the one doing the interviews because at least you talk to so many different peoples and gather so many perspectives. That's what people need.
I would be curious to talk to Steven just to have him on here and be able to discuss a lot of the work that goes behind the Sixth Floor Museum. And maybe at some point, I'll get him down the line or something like that. But I'm happy that he treated you right and he gave you the time that you needed. I know we've done many other episodes, me and you, where we've discussed a lot more about your book and specific details and other things as well, too, about the case. I wanted to kind of have this one on to kind of just ask you some questions about some statements. I was looking at some audio versions. It's like 30 years, 40 years after the fact. So I need to know from your perspective on going through this as a researcher. And also I wanted to get a little bit about your experience about the Sixth Floor Museum interview. Also, on the wrapping point here, I want you to be able to promote your channel and other things that you have started up and got going so people can check out your channel, look at some of the breakdowns that you do on some of the, either whether it's witnesses or evidence or anything that you would like to specifically talk about, which I think is important all on its own. We have a lot of channels out there doing some JFK stuff. I think it's important that researchers are now putting it on an online platform besides just writing a blog, but putting it in a video format and trying to make sure that people can get the information.
Well, thank you. And I am trying to modernize my work and make it available to more people, especially younger people. And so my YouTube channel is youtube.com slash at JFK case not closed. And what it is, it's only 2 videos right now, but I've got 25 done and will be posted over time. And these videos all highlight areas of evidence and witnesses that were dismissed, ignored, altered, or suppressed by the Warren Commission to frame Lee Harvey Oswald as the lone assassin of JFK. And I believe, had this evidence been presented in a court of law, that Oswald would have been with at least reasonable doubt would have been established as to him being a lone assassin. And I think that isn't necessarily good because I think he was involved. I just don't think he fired a shot that day. So thank you for this opportunity, Robbie. I always enjoy talking with you. Thank you so much.
Dave, pleasure is all mine. And thank you, everybody, for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank. I'll make sure to link Dave's links in the description below to check out his stuff. Please subscribe to his channel. Give him some likes, give him some love. Leave a comment. Positivity is always best. And thank you, everybody, for listening to this episode. Stay tuned for our next one.